Georgia, home to peaches, Coca-Cola, and now one of the most liberal voter laws. Yes, I said liberal, because when you look at it with a broad legal framework, with a broad legal mindset, it is actually a liberal law, and we will explain why today. I'm Andrew Esquire, and this is The Legal Mindset, where we help give you an unfair advantage. And today, we're going to talk about Georgia's new voting law. Now, you may have heard about this in the news. You may have heard about it from many liberal news outlets, which labeled it as horrible things, racist, bigoted, trying to disenfranchise voters, which means disenfranchise is actually trying to prevent them from voting. So anytime you hear disenfranchise, just think preventing people from voting. So you've got it called this disenfranchising law. You've got it called nasty things like Jim Crow in a suit. Really disgusting language from liberal news agencies. But what is the reality? What is the reality of this voter law? That's what we're going to get into when we look at it legally. And we're not just going to look at it with a narrow legal framework. We're going to look at it with a wide framework. We're going to look at it not just in the context of the US, but in context of the world. So let's start with the law itself. What does that do? Well, what it does is require absentee ballots to follow a similar validation procedure as in-person voting. Now, what is required for in-person voting in Georgia? Let's think about that. Now, some people might say, Andrew, in-person voting is really intense. It requires something complicated like a passport. Well, if it did require a passport, that would be a problem. Because guess what? Only 40% of Americans actually own a passport. So if it required a passport to vote, that would actually disenfranchise voters. That would actually cause people to not vote because they don't have passports. But in fact, in Georgia, you do not need a passport to vote. You could also vote with a military ID, a tribal ID, a government employee badge, any ID you have from any state or federal government agency. So let's say you're a firefighter, police officer, maybe you work in the postal office and you have that postal ID badge with your photo on it. That is good in Georgia. Let's say you have any other form of government issued photo ID. Maybe you have a concealed carry permit. Hey, maybe you even have a medical marijuana permit and you have an ID picture on it. Any sort of ID with a picture on it would be good enough for Georgia. Now, people might say, Andrew, driver's licenses, that's the thing that most people have. Okay, well, is a driver's license good enough in Georgia? Well, yes, it is. A driver's license is in fact good enough for Georgia. Now, when some people ask, they say, Andrew, there's studies that say that minorities and disenfranchised groups in America historically have not had driver's licenses. It is true that in certain states like New Mexico, based on studies we have from over a decade ago, so old studies, there were facts found that white voters tended to have driver's licenses that were valid and not expired more often than minority voters. So once again, it was found in old studies, certain studies, that in fact white voters were more likely to have a valid driver's license than non-white voters. I mean, and let's be real about it. Driving while license suspended or getting your license suspended is a fairly common occurrence. I know tons of people that get this. And if you want to actually learn about the key to getting out of this, check out my video, Escape the Police. I talk all about driving with license suspended and how crazy common that is. But in fact, Georgia took this into account. Georgia actually, in the existing law, says a photo ID can be an expired driver's license. Yes, even an old and expired driver's license is enough for Georgia. Now, you might say that cars and having a driver's license at all is more for the wealthy. Even if it is expired driver's license, the wealthy are more likely to have driver's licenses than the poor. And okay, let's presume that's true. Well, guess what? There's another option in Georgia. Yes, one more option on top of that, free IDs. Yes, free IDs are given out at county registrars and at the DMV. So you can show up regardless of whether you want to drive or not and get a free ID in Georgia. So there's a free option that is available to anybody, regardless of whether you want to drive or not drive. So Georgia allows for a ton of options. In fact, they also have a catch-all option of any other state or government issued photo ID. So pretty much anything that's going to show your face and show that you're able to vote. And the latest law actually added days. Instead of subtracting days, it actually added days for early voting. And that's kind of odd given that the government is controlled by Republicans. And early voting tends to favor Democrats. So it seems like they're giving something to the other side in the form of 4 extra early voting days. That's actually a big gift on the part of the Republican-controlled Georgia Congress. But let's look at this in a wider scope, because once again, people are saying this is unreasonable, this is ridiculous. Well, let's look at a country that a lot of liberals love. Let's look at one that Michael Moore loves. He always goes over there and says, hey, the food is good, the culture is great, and the healthcare is even better. La belle France. France. France is always touted as a model of a liberal economy, as a totally just, totally cool, totally woke, and amazing government. Well, guess what? France hasn't allowed mail-in voting since 1975. In fact, that's the big issue here, is that in 1975, Corsica, yes, the island that brought us greats such as Napoleon, that island had massive mail-in voter fraud. They pretty much scammed the entire 1975 election through massive voter fraud. So France said, hey, voter fraud, it's a huge issue, and it's particular with mail-in voting. Now, we have to distinguish between mail-in voting and absentee voting, because we have that difference here in the United States. We have the difference between what happened during the big R, the Rona time, where we all mailed in our ballots, which was kind of odd because we normally wouldn't go to elections or perform elections that way. That was different, and a lot of countries made those exceptions due to Rona. But absentee ballots are something that's been done in the United States for decades now. Absentee ballots are generally those that are in the military, they're abroad, or they're otherwise not able to come to the polls. That's something that we've done for a very long time. We've had people outside the country that have been able to mail their ballots in, and that's something that's widely accepted. But other countries often don't care as much as the United States. In fact, like I just said, the United States is liberal in that sense. Other states, other countries are conservative. They say, hey, we don't care if you're out of the country. We don't care if you're in the military. We don't care where you are in the world. If you can't come back home, for example, to France and vote, well, then you can't vote. And that's the same way it is in most of Europe. Yes, the EU, even the beloved countries. I know Bernie would be jumping up and down and then be very sad because he would learn that his favorite Nordic countries, we're thinking Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, all those countries don't allow mail-in voting. And what has Sweden said? What has their top officials said? Well, they said it leads to too much fraud. There's too much potential for fraud with mail-in and absentee type voting, and therefore they just don't allow it. But does Georgia's new law ban mail-in voting? In fact, no, it does not. It requires an ID. And even countries that allow mail-in voting, like Japan and Poland. Heck, I love pierogies, but Poland is way more conservative, way more strict with those pierogies, because you know what? They only allow voting by mail if you're disabled or if you prove you cannot get to the polls. Japan, the same way. They require proof that you can't come to the polls. And if you don't provide that proof, you can't vote. And in this way, Georgia is just so much more liberal. So next time anybody tries to tell you that Georgia's laws are regressive, that they're racist, that they're from the 1950s, you can tell them that comparatively, we are in the 22nd century when it comes to voter laws. And this is the huge difference between what happens in reality and what happens in the court of public opinion.